What's up, guys? Hey, for this week's midweek teaching, we're going to be doing a behind-the-scenes kind of look at our new series, Functional Church. I'm going to let you guys hear from, I jumped on a Zoom call with Alex and Stephan. They're part of our research team for sermon series and sermons. Man, these guys are so helpful in this area. They're very knowledgeable. They spend a ton of time with this stuff in order to help me. And so I want you to hear from them. We're going to be talking about a bunch of stuff, man. What was going on in Paul's life? How many letters are actually in the book of 2 Corinthians? I mean, all this kind of stuff, you're going to want to hear it. So let's jump into this call. All right. Hey, guys. What's up, man? Excited for our midweek with y'all today. Man, I want to introduce you guys, for anybody who doesn't know, Alex Nolette is part of our, he does Quip, writes a lot for our kind of our Bible reading plan and blogs and all that kind of stuff. But man, he is a researcher and does a lot with our sermon planning team. And man, this guy just wakes up in the morning and loves to read deep theology, and that's what he loves to do. And hockey.
Hockey.
Stephan, man, excited to have you on as well. Stephan's been around here for a couple years, one of our sharpest young eagles, what we call them. I mean, just these men and women that God is raising up from our college ministries and on up. He is a proud student of North Carolina A&T. Is that right?
The illustrious North Carolina A&T State University.
Doing that.
You got to add the illustrious in there, man.
And he's actually studying engineering, but at the same time is working with our church in our sermon research team. And primarily kind of digging into, we view other sermons and other series as such a resource. And so Stephan is kind of really helping with that and our sermon planning process, which I'm going to let him explain to you guys a little bit here in a little while. Okay, as promised, man, we just want to do a bit of a deep dive into 2 Corinthians today for everybody that is jumping into our new series, Functional Church. A lot has changed since 1 Corinthians to 2 Corinthians, and there is a majority of people that are kind of following Paul's teaching now, but it brings up so much. So I want to bounce off of these guys. I'll make some comments here and there about some things I'm excited about, but we're just going to do a short form kind of discussion over this. And Alex, I'd love to start with you in terms of, man, just kind of, why don't you let us in on sort of what is happening in Paul's world, where this fits into the New Testament, you know, that kind of idea for people who may not get all the way behind the background of it all.
Yeah, actually, one of the really cool parts of being part of sermon research is being able to study something like this, because I would say 2 Corinthians or the Corinthian Correspondence is kind of what I had studied the least about Paul. And so being able to study for this book has been a really kind of eye-opening experience. And I can see now why understanding the background is so important to really understanding these letters. So really, Paul had been sent as a missionary from Antioch. And he and Silas at this time were kind of making their way around in a circle. It'd probably be like opposite. But he was establishing churches. He had established Galatia, but the churches in Galatia by the time he had got to Corinth. He had established the churches in Thessalonica and in Philippi, and he had just had a meeting in Athens where he preached in the Areopagus. And probably sometime around that Athens experience, scholars say that he probably wrote Galatians. So up until the point where he got to Corinth, he probably had only written Galatians in terms of the letters that we have in the New Testament. So he comes into Corinth, and Corinth is a really, really cool city because it's like a huge marketplace, basically, because it's what they call an isthmus, and it was like a 7-mile strip of land that kind of separated Asia and Italy. And so a lot of people would exchange these goods here and take goods to Italy or take goods to Asia. And here's an interesting fact, you know, from 100 like in the hundreds BC, they were trying to build a canal across this because it would save 6 months of sailing across the Greek Peloponnese in order to just go across the 7 miles that Corinth rested on. but that was only completed in the 1900s AD. So
these are the things that you know.
Yeah,
this is why you're on the sermon team.
that's
Okay,
right.
please continue. Please continue.
Yeah. So, anyways, huge marketplace, buying and selling, and so what Paul does when he comes into Corinth is he starts a tent making business with Priscilla and Aquila. Now, what's really interesting is there's a lot of debate around timelines of Paul's ministry and all of that, but there are actually certain things that we can be sure of. We know, or historians have said, that in AD 49, the Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome. And Luke says in Acts 18:2, I believe, that that Priscilla and Aquila were a part of those that had been expelled from Rome. So they were already in Corinth after the expulsion. So we know that Paul arrived sometime after AD 49. And then also when Paul's in Corinth, and you can read about this in Acts 18:12, he is brought before Gallio, which is the proconsul of Rome, basically the governor of Corinth, the Roman governor of Corinth, because Corinth was a Roman colony. He's brought before them by the Jews, and we know from archaeological evidence that Gallio served as proconsul in Corinth in AD 51. So it's actually really cool. Like, we can actually say, here are the dates of what's going on. Also, just a quick side note that I found really fascinating is where Paul was brought before Gallio is called the judgment seat, or the bema seat. Like, it was an actual place in Corinth. So just thinking about the background, you have 2 Corinthians 5:20, I believe, or 5:10, where Paul says we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ. And so just knowing that that was an actual place in Corinth, and he's writing to the Corinthians about this, it's just really fascinating. Anyways, to kind of wrap up, he's supporting his own ministry through tent making, which was his trade, in this big marketplace. And every Sabbath, he's going and preaching in the synagogue. So people are starting to believe. And then when his kind of his crew comes in, you have Timothy and Silas, I believe, come in from Macedonia. This is a little bit of speculation on my part, but I think that they actually bring money in support from other churches to Paul, because it says after they came and visited him, he was able to do ministry full time. He like gave himself fully to the mission of God when they arrived. So something allowed him to stop working in tent making. And so anyways, after all of that, he establishes the churches in Corinth. He probably writes 1st and 2nd Thessalonians from Corinth. And then he goes over into Asia, does a lot of work for several years in Ephesus. And in Ephesus is when all the Corinthian correspondence, like the letters between Corinth and Paul, start happening.
Yeah, and it's that stuff is rich. It's good. I mean, some of it is some of it's speculative. It's like, man, we're doing a best guess.
Yep.
Some of it's just literally the Bible. What the Bible tells us, and is checked out with archaeological evidence and historical evidence. Others of us piecing it together. I think it's a worthwhile exercise, though. I would say, and I think you would agree with this, Alex. You don't have to have those things in order for the meaning to be intact.
Yep.
Yet it can kind of fill in, and like you're saying with the judgment seat and all that. I mean, like, those types of things can really kind of round out a narrative. Stephan, let's shift gears. I want to use this time to kind of play back and forth, because without the preaching event, some of the theological stuff is not as impactful, but without the theological stuff, we don't have anything to say. So it's like, man, there's kind of an interplay with the preaching and some of the theology and background and all of that. Stephan, I would love for us to zoom out and not even about Corinthians for just a moment, and just talk about your role in sermon planning. We say at Mercy Hill, everything is better in community, including the sermon. Man, maybe just give our listeners here a little bit of an insight into what goes into the sermon, your part in that, just your own personal kind of view of how that goes down.
Yeah, most def. So I am on I'm on the sermon briefing side of things in the sermon planning team, and just in sermon research, right? Now I think sometimes when we hear the word sermon research, some people may have some misconceptions. So I'm gonna tell you three things I don't do, and then I'm gonna tell you three things, man, as to why we do them, right? So I mean, like the one thing that we don't do is that we don't write Hopper sermons. I think if you hear research, you're like, oh, okay, man, like, well, what does Hopper do, right? So, we don't write Hopper sermons. Another thing that we don't do is that we do not replace or reduce Hopper's personal study, and get into the commentaries and the original languages. And another thing that we don't do is that, man, we don't exactly, we don't tell, Pastor Hopper, hey, this is where I think you should go, in that direction. But,
Well,
man,
Alex
where
does that sometimes.
yeah. Oh, okay. Well,
Guilty.
I know.
I'm just kidding, man. I'm joking.
Nah. Oh man, that's funny. That's funny, man. But yeah, man. But where I kind of come in is, man, I kind of just look up, man, a couple pastors, man, who have, man, just great insights, man. And from this, man, we're able to multiply time, multiply perspective, and to multiply reach, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, man, when we by multiplying time, man, Popper, he is just one guy, right? And there are, man, thousands of of other people, man, who have just deep knowledge, man. So why not multiply that effectiveness by 2 or 3 by pulling some other wells to drink from, in a sense, right, man? So another thing that we as I kind of look into other pastors and stuff is trying to get different perspectives. So we multiply perspectives, right? They may preach, they preach the same gospel, they preach from the same Bible, but they may come from a different text or context, man, that'll help us, man, and in trying to make sure that, man, these biblical truths, man, are sticky into the minds, man, of the congregation, right? So that means we're pulling from legends of today, people like a Piper, a Keller, H.B. Charles, and even Bible teachers like Jen Wilkin, or even legends of the past like Martin Lloyd Jones or Charles Spurgeon, right, man, to try to figure out, man, what were the perspectives that they had on things, man, and how can we, man, apply that, man, to the audience today. And then by that, man, we're able to multiply reach. So again, man, from multiple perspectives, man, you're able to multiply reach because, people in our congregation, they don't all come from the same background, right? Many different ethnicities, many different religious upbringings. So by those things, man, that's kind of like where I kind of come in and try to see, like, all right, man, what did pastors have to say, man? What do they have to say, man, to make these truths, sticky and understandable and digestible, man, for the congregants to hear?
Yeah. Well, Stephan, what you guys do is so important. And man, I love it. I love the way you framed that. I've never framed it that way, but I think we will from now on. You guys y'all don't replace what me or whoever's preaching do, but you do multiply the experience. And, I always say, man, your sermon sounds like who you've been talking to. It sounds like what you've been reading. It sounds like who you've been listening to. And if you got a group of people that are doing that, then you just have so many more voices. And what you guys do so good, particularly both of y'all, is, man, you're able to get through a lot more material so that we can sift it, so that we can figure out the gold. I mean, anybody listening to this, I mean, you go through a whole sermon that I preach, and you come out with 4 or 5 big things probably where you're like, hey, that illustration hit me really well. Or this, I mean, I'll preach for 40 minutes and it's like, man, I only got 4 or 5 things. Well, that's everybody. So if we can do that for the commentaries, if we can do that for multiple sermons, we end up getting a lot of gold that I think is sifted through well. And you guys are able to kind of, present that in a way where we're able to kind of feast on, I think, what is like kind of the best from the passage, if you will. So really pumped for what you guys do. Now, Stephan, let me stay with you for a minute here. Let's think about some of the ways, because it really begins to go together. And then Alex, I'll bounce it to you because there's been pushback on this. But in our view, Stephan, because we did some stuff on the beginning of this, how are we viewing the way that 2 Corinthians breaks down? Because we're only preaching a portion of the book through the series, and there's a reason for that. So how would you explain that?
Yeah, man. Well, the thing that I think is very interesting about 2 Corinthians is that, man, it preaches on a lot of themes. There are these abrupt changes. Alex will get into the detail. I'm probably going to touch on just a little bit of those divisions and stuff like that. But again, man, if you were to read the book, man, and you kind of pay close attention, man, you'll start to see these shifts a little bit. And if you're reading it straight through, man, you're going to see eventually, man, these natural divisions. So, man, the way how the book of Second Corinthians kind of plays out is that chapters 1 through 7, in a sense, man, is Paul just explaining his ministry, right, man? He's explaining his ministry. We start to see his heart and concern for the church. But then, if you were to look at, man, like from chapters chapter 2, verse 14, all the way to chapter 7 to verse 4, man, which is like a pretty good meat and chunk of the text, man, all scholars would end up, kind of saying that, man, that's actually like a little bit of a division there. And again, as we see these different shifts and stuff like that, and these abrupt changes, I'm going to touch on this. Alex is going to touch on it more in detail, but it's just that, man, people have thought, these were different letters at some point, that they were different letters, or there may be different fragments of letters, right? So, man, I think, man, through chapter 2 verses to verse 14 and 7 to 4, man, you're going to end up seeing those things as well. And then also in chapters 8 through 9, you're going to see Paul encouraging the church, man, towards generosity, for the poor Christians who are in Jerusalem. And then in chapters 10 and 13, you're going to see Paul's defense of his ministry, through his experiences, man, against these super apostles who were living these lavish lifestyles when Paul was actively pursuing the sufferings of Christ, right? And then some of the textual criticisms that come from that, man, again, as I said, people have thought that these were different letters and stuff at one point, but even though we may hear them, we're just like, yo, man, should we even trust that? All scholars, and I would even agree with them, is just like, man, it is still the same author and the same audience. And most of all, it's the same guy, who is writing, man, this story, using the hearts of men as his ink, man, to tell this precious story, man, of a broken and messed up people, man, who are yet, man, being perfected by a perfect Savior. So, man, I'm excited for this book, man. I'm really excited, man, how we're going to go into
that's good, Stephan. And we made the call. We made the call to kind of preach through chapter 7. Really thinking through like the contrast from dysfunction to function. And we understand that a lot of it's a defensive ministry, but there's a lot in the first 7 chapters of the book that show you there's a majority that have repented and they are following Paul. Alex, pick up on the theme that Stephan is talking about in terms of it's kind of a big debate, the letter fragments. Is there reason? I mean, I know there's some reason to believe that, but what's the position that? Well, just talk about it. Just what do you think? What should we be thinking? How do we hold that as something that's not primary issue, but loosely, but also understand there may be something to it or not?
Yeah, I mean, kind of like moving from the end to the front of kind of how Stephan talked about it. It's really easy in academic and scholarly fields to think like, if it's not a single letter, then we've gotten the Bible wrong, and we're no longer believing in Christ or something like that. Like if this is not just one unified letter, like the Bible is lying to us or something. And that's not it at all. I mean, it is still the Word of God, regardless of if it's one letter or not. I would say that, up until probably the 90s, there was pretty much this scholarly consensus that said these are like as much as 5 different letters, and some even break down 8 and 9 to be 2 different letters. Like one talking about like an earlier like preparation for the collection of Jerusalem. And then a second letter about the collection of Jerusalem and generosity, kind of spurring them on, like as it comes closer to the time to give. One of the fascinating theories that I'm not sure is, I personally believe it's a unified letter, and I think that there's a lot of scholars that are coming out now and properly defending that. I do find the theory that chapters 10 through 13 is what is called the sorrowful letter that Paul talks about earlier in 2 Corinthians. That 10 through 13 is that kind of added. I find that to be an interesting theory, although at the end of the day, I would probably say no, it's just one letter.
Man, for people that aren't in this world, there's a lot of interesting theories
Yes.
about a lot of things in the Bible, and it's, and I think I take the same position that you do, Alex. It's like, I'd love to know those things. And there have been times where I've been swayed by some of that, by different things where I say, oh man, I never thought about it that way or whatever. But in general, sometimes I feel like, man, is that our best use of time to try to parse out, is this 5 letters, 7 letters, or whatever? Or is it more like, hey man, there's really no reason, there's no real heavy hitting reason not to just take it at face value what it is.
Yeah.
And the power of it is there regardless. So I don't spend a ton of time thinking about that stuff, but I do think in a forum like this, where we're trying to get to some of the background and all of that. Now you mentioned, let's just hit this while you're talking about it. You mentioned the Sorrowful Letter. Man, it's also probably true that there could have been other letters that we don't have.
Yep.
So what is kind of the dominant theme, Alex, on, not theme, what are some of the dominant thoughts on how many letters? It is confusing because 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, if you take the Sorrowful Letter to be not 1 Corinthians or 10 through 13 of 2 Corinthians, then you're already admitting there's another letter. Is this chronology right? It can get a little wonky. How many letters? How important is that? That kind of thing.
Yeah. So the easiest way to explain this would to just be a really concise, chronology of Paul's correspondence with the Corinthians. So the really quick note at first is, after Paul leaves, Priscilla and Aquila find this guy named Apollos, and they say, hey, you're a great speaker. They kind of make sure that his gospel presentation is solid, and then they say you should go and minister to the churches in Corinth. So Apollos spends a couple months ministering in Corinth, and then he goes and meets Paul in Ephesus and gives him an update on what's going on in Corinth. Maybe even bringing a letter to Paul that the Corinthians wrote. So what ends up happening is Apollos is kind of like, look, man, there are some things that they're not getting right. There are factions that are starting. Some say they're following me, some say they're following you, all this kind of thing. And they also send a letter to Paul asking him certain things. And we know this to be the fact because in 1 Corinthians 5, 9 through 10, Paul says, Paul responds to some of the allegations and some of the questions that the Corinthians had, because he says, in the letter that I wrote to you, telling you not to associate with those who call themselves Christians but live in sexual immorality. He says, so we know for a fact that 1 Corinthians was not the first letter that Paul wrote to Corinth. And so from Apollos, I need to go back and retrace, but from Apollos's kind of testimony as to what was happening in Corinth, Paul wrote a letter and basically saying, hey, these things I hear, let me tell you what's right. The Corinthians then wrote a letter back to him, asking him a bunch of questions about spiritual gifts, about marriage, food sacrificed to idols, and things like that. And we know that they wrote this letter because in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, now about the things that you wrote me. And so there is evidence in 1 Corinthians that he wrote a letter to them, they wrote a letter to him, and then 1 Corinthians comes after that. So at the very least, 1 Corinthians is the second letter that Paul wrote to Corinth. That can just be established by the Bible itself. Now, after that is when we get into more speculation. So it seems as if Timothy reports to Paul, because Timothy was the one who brought the 1 Corinthian letter. Timothy reports to Paul to say, hey, your instructions really weren't heeded. And and weren't followed, and there are these great divisions, and there's people speaking against you and all that, enough to where Paul had to drop everything in Ephesus and go and take the 1 week journey to get to Corinth because he thought it was like an emergency situation. And he calls this the painful visit. And so he goes in, and basically I think he's just saying, like, those who are sinning, who are in sin, need to repent, and to try to get people back on his side. So he does that. He goes back to Ephesus. He hears once again that they really didn't respond to that either. And so, like, some antagonists have come in and said, Paul's nothing. One note that I really noticed is about the culture of Corinth being an honor and shame society. Like, it was all about honor. They have these people who are coming into Corinth and saying, Paul is beaten and bloodied. He doesn't look good. He doesn't speak very well. How in the world could you follow this guy? And they're saying, follow us. We are like masters of rhetoric and all this kind of stuff. And so Paul then writes what is called the Sorrowful Letter. And we can know from 2 Corinthians 2 that he wrote this letter, and that they responded. They practiced discipline on his opponents, and that a majority of them, like, turned from what they were doing and kind of came back to Paul and acknowledged his apostolic authority. So 2 Corinthians is almost Paul's kind of joy and expression of saying, I'm so glad that God has brought repentance among you, and that by the sorrow that I caused you, that you have responded to it in repentance, and that I'm going to come to you again. So that's kind of like, it would almost, a lot of people say, at the very least, 2 Corinthians is basically the fourth letter that Paul wrote to Corinth.
I mean, we don't really know, because there could be other things before. There are some that believe that the 1 Corinthians is a sorrowful letter.
Yep.
There, I think you have the issue of the church discipline in 1 Corinthians potentially not matching you assume there's church discipline mentioned in both letters. One's initiation, one's the resolve. But then in 2 Corinthians, Paul, it's like, man, is this more about what's been sinned against with him? So is there something that we're missing in the middle, that middle painful letter? I mean, there's just a lot of those things that I think that we want to learn and study, but we also realize, like, man, if God wanted us to have the painful letter, letter of tears, whatever, like, we would have it, and it would be clearly marked. So for some reason, this is what has been accepted into the canon. And so, we can have these discussions, but I'm not sure that's more fruitful than just kind of buying in, to the truth of the letter. Actually, Stephan, I want to go back to you real quick, and then we'll wrap this up, because, the discussion of all the letters and all that stuff, people are going to say it's academic, so what? But what you believe about that probably does play out in the way that you preach it, and some of the way that you attack it. So, and I'm not trying to get in anybody's mind, but you mentioned some of the guys that we're following in this series, and others. I mean, how have you seen different preachers as we're looking at, different series churches have done? I think, Alex, from what you told me, I think our take on doing like a whole series through the first 7 chapters is kind of unique. There's been other series that have done. How have you seen other people try to slice it, Stephan?
Yeah, man, I would completely agree with Alex on that, man. I mean, it really is unique. You would be surprised when we were going in to this. It was funny. One of the things that almost delayed the process was just the fact that we could not find, a strong sermon series on 2 Corinthians. And probably, because of some of those criticisms and because of those breakdowns. It seemed like, man, the only, 2 people who may have done, that type of series in the past were, people like MacArthur or Ferguson. But, other than that, man, it's like, man, people have not really done this book as a whole. But some people, they have kind of pulled, from some of those breakdowns and sections within the text. So if you do hear a sermon on it, or it's tied into a sermon series, it'll often be tied into things such as reconciliation, chapter 5, generosity 8 through 9, or even spiritual triumph and how God's power can be made strong in our weaknesses, in chapter 12. But even still, very few, man, you may hear of that. So.
Well, man, we'll leave it there, guys. We could keep talking about this stuff. I'll just wrap up with this. Like, I feel like when we kind of landed on, like, man, let's take a clearly defined section of this letter, we do end up leaving out some of the sugar stick sermons from the book. Not the reconciliation sermon, but when you start thinking about generosity, when you start thinking about what I think is a predominant theme, the idea of weakness, Alex, to your point, honor culture, climb the ladder. I mean, Paul's life was an absurdity, I think, to the Corinthian church. But it was through weakness that God really shows his strength. And we'll talk about some of those things, but we are going to miss some of them. But I decided, ultimately my call, that it was going to be better to show a cohesive section that kind of flows and be able to show Paul defending his ministry to win over the minority, but in the presence of the majority that has already been repentant. And they've gone from dysfunction to function, and we thought that hung together really well. So we made the decision to do that. But guys, I really appreciate y'all. Man, you guys do a great job and just obviously so knowledgeable about this stuff. Thank y'all for coming on this week. And man, we'll have to have you guys back. This is good. Maybe we'll make this kind of a thing we do for the series. But anyway, appreciate you guys, and that's it.
No problem.